Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Combat Zone. I'm Nick. He's Joe. And this is the one place where the enemy has only four things to say. Abandon ship, bail out, take cover, and I surrender. So,
a little bit of dead air there for a minute, Nick.
Yeah, well, for some reason, I'm not hearing anything in my headphones, which means it's probably not plugged in.
And your headphones are not plugged in?
You know, it's funny how...
It helps a lot when your headphones are plugged in.
Yeah, because I was waiting for the sound. Where's the... There. No. Hang on, folks. We have this little technical glitch we have to get.
Okay, well, while we're doing that...
Yeah, well, yeah, we can carry on.
There it is. Okay.
So if I just plug this in right here, like that, all my problems
are
solved.
We are... I just want to make sure that everybody understands that we are pros. Do not think that we are not pros.
Do not try this at home.
No. Okay, Nick got it. Nick got his headphones plugged in.
Yes, I can tell.
You can hear the crowd cheering in the background there, Nick.
We're all set.
We're all set. Okay, number to call, 844-415-2115, toll free anywhere in North America if you want to call and join the conversation live. And don't forget, you could join in by chat. Just click on the chat bubble on the player online. And if you have to register, it may prompt you to register or to sign in. Go ahead and register. It doesn't cost you anything. It's free.
And painless.
And painless, relatively so. And you get to chat live. So here we are, Nick.
Yes, here we are. I just want to start off by saying here, for those of you not from the Ottawa area for listening in other places, we had a 11-year-old girl went missing in the city about a week ago, and they just found her today. She's safe and sound home.
Thank God.
Yeah, no kidding. I was delighted to hear that because as a parent myself, it's one of a parent's worst nightmares is to have one of your children disappear with no answers about where they went, why they went, what happened to them.
No.
You know, it's just a horrible, horrible scenario.
Now you know, Nick, I'm not a Twitter fiend. Or LinkedIn or any social media. But I do have a Facebook account. I do have a Twitter account. I do have a LinkedIn account. And I generally follow the news. I don't obsess about it, but I follow the news. And my wife told me today that this girl had been found. And I have to tell you, I didn't even know that she was missing. And it's really strange that way because you'd think with all of the possible opportunities to inform people with Amber Alerts, et cetera, that I would have known because I'm not exactly in a cocoon that separates me from the mass media world, obviously. So I just I was surprised, thankful, obviously, thankful for those parents and for the girl herself, but I was a little surprised that I had not heard about this, and I don't really think it's because I wasn't paying attention. You generally pay attention to those things.
Well, it's funny because my wife knew more about the story than I did. Now, being a mother, this is of primary importance to a mom to know where your kids are and if they're all safe. Like we have a term of endearment for our kids. We call them the chicklets, and she wants to know when one of them is gone on a trip that they got back okay, and then in her head you can see her ticking down the list of names, ticking off to make sure all her chicklets are safe, or if they're coming out to the valley that they all showed up okay, and that kind of thing. So when you have an issue like this, you're on one hand we had the tragic story earlier of a 4-year-old boy who drowned in the St. Lawrence River, whose body, to the best of my knowledge, they never recovered.
I was just about to ask you if they've recovered the body, but I guess not.
Not that I know of. So you've got that horror story on one side,
right?
And then you have this story, which ended, in a much happier ending. The girls, we don't know anything more about her. I was listening to the news today, but she's been found. Apparently, she's unharmed, and she's one of these young ladies. She's only 11. And they were afraid that she was caught up by human traffickers, and you know what that's code for, for being drawn into the world of prostitution and so on. And for all they knew, she could have been, halfway across the world. So just ecstatic to report that this young lady's been found and is safe. Well, based on what we know, I'm assuming by now she's home with her family and everything's fine.
Right. Well, and it'll be interesting to learn. She's been missing for a week or so, hasn't she?
It's been about a week.
So
today.
I'll be interested in knowing the story behind this, because I'm sure that an 11-year-old wasn't just sitting outside in some field somewhere for a week. Nobody paid attention. She didn't eat. She had to send. So
the police got a tip from a member of the public, and they acted on the tip and found her. Now, that's all we know.
Okay.
So,
I'm not going to speculate.
Yeah, exactly. It's dangerous to speculate.
Of course.
I'm hoping in the next day or two we'll know more, but at least she's okay. She's,
right.
There could have been much more horrific end.
Right.
And I'm glad to hear that in this case it looks like it's going to work out, for the better.
Right. And while we're talking about things working out for the better, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't give a shout out to all of those people in South Florida who are enduring the wrath of Hurricane Michael as we speak.
Now, you and I had an interesting, a little bit of a conversation about this before we descended into the bunker tonight. And if I'm living in Florida, Florida to me is about, okay, you got a hurricane coming. The terrain is flat. I don't think there's a peak in Florida that's more than 50 or 75 feet above sea level. I might be wrong. Maybe I'm completely wrong. But on the Panhandle at least, like out on the part that sticks out into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, I don't think there's anything that's much taller than that other than buildings.
I believe you're right.
So if you get a storm surge, the way that they're talking about storm surges, what stops it from washing halfway inland?
Right. Well, these storm surges, they dissipate over territory, over distance. So
right.
even if there are no natural impediments, they're not going to go that far inland. It's not like a tsunami or anything like that. But look, people being who and what they are, some of them are going to up and evacuate, even if they're not under an evacuation order, because they're going, well, what do I want to stick around in a hurricane for?
Yeah.
But so there are those people. And then there are people on the other end of the spectrum who are going to go, well, I could ride it out. I've ridden out hurricanes before. My understanding is that this one was particularly powerful, though. So, but there are going to be people who are going to stick around and go, shrug their shoulders and say we can take it. So it's really hard to say. But irrespective of all of that, I think that our thoughts and prayers go out to all of those people, whether they evacuated and are safe, or they're there and are running the potential of being in danger. Everybody is suffering, from if not physical discomfort, they're certainly suffering from property loss. So it's quite a quite a cataclysmic event down there right now.
You've got to be of a certain mental breed toughness. You certainly have to have certain mental calluses to survive in a place like Florida, because when they get storms. Now, they're not hurricanes, but they get storms rather frequently down because of the warm water and, the Gulf of Mexico and all those
right.
kind of contributing factors. And I know in Louisiana they have hurricane parties. Now, I don't know about Florida. They probably do. Anybody along the Gulf Coast, I would think, would fall into that, where it's their way of laughing at nature that, it's the old London Blitz, we can take it too mentality.
Yeah.
So you have to have certain kind of mindset to say, screw it, we're staying, because
sure. Yeah, you're right, and as I say, there are those people who are, at the first hint of a major storm, are packing up and heading, up to their relatives' place, inland and Midwest United States or something like that. I don't know,
higher ground.
Let's just say higher ground. There are those who at the other end of the spectrum who just say, tough. I can ride it out. And as you say, I mean, I've heard of these hurricane parties. So, but I have to tell you, I mean, I've experienced North Atlantic storms.
Yes.
More than I really want to remember. And trust me, okay, one is more than you really want to remember if it's a real one. And as you well know, Nick, And now I could say that I've experienced tornadoes because we had the tornado just pass by us a couple of weeks ago here in Ottawa. One of, I think, a half a dozen, I was told, tornadoes.
Yeah, I was surprised how many there were.
Yeah, so I don't even know where I was going with this, except to say that, that people just get used to these kinds of things, and I don't understand why somebody would have a hurricane party, but there are just people that do. And people die from these in these events as well. Mm-hmm. So I don't know I don't know if it's people who are just unprepared or people who are quote unquote prepared or think they're adequately prepared and they're attending one of these hurricane parties. I really don't know.
It gives the whole term of being blown away a whole new meaning.
No, that's no, too soon, Nick. Too soon. We're right in the middle of the storm. But am I the only one that is anticipating, that very soon, if not tonight or tomorrow morning, I'm going to flick on my computer because I don't have TV, and I'm going to be looking at the news online, and lo and behold, I'm going to see everybody talking about how this is just one more indication of global warming and climate change, and we have to do something to stop this cataclysmic climate change. I was reading some headlines this week where about the latest report suggesting that it's a matter of life and death, imminent life and death. We must stop the world from heating up 1/2 degree Celsius.
1.5 degrees.
Was it 1.5 degrees?
Because they said that now they're forecasting. I saw the same article. I have it posted on my Facebook page where they were saying it's going to rise by 3 degrees, not 3/4 of a degree or 1 degree. Now 3. So they have to they have to cap it at 1.5. The arrogance of that, first of all, is staggering.
Well,
but how do you do that?
Well, there's look, we as I don't have to explain to people that I'm when it comes to the pseudoscience around this. I just don't buy it. I don't buy any of it. I'm not arguing against climate change. I think there is such a thing as climate change. I just don't believe in man-made climate change. Right. But there is the practical reality, quite apart from the science. Let's just assume for the sake of argument that the science around this and all of the models and the predictions and the prognostications are all accurate. And if we don't do something serious right now to get this under control, that the world could end 50 years from now or 100 or whatever the latest prediction is. Let's take the most dire prediction.
Right.
Okay. 100 years or whatever it is, okay? So let's assume that all of that is correct. Here's the thing that we in the West, quote unquote, don't seem to get, or all of the alarmists in the West don't seem to get. We're not actually the ones producing the so-called greenhouse gases. It's China, it's India, and it's much of the developing world. So all of this begs, I think, an obvious question, and that is, how are we going to stop them from doing it? Because we already have, over the last number of years, reduced, rightly or wrongly, our emissions. We continue to look for ways to reduce our emissions, and proportionately, our emissions were not the problem really in the first place.
Right.
So, has anybody actually asked what it is that we're supposed to do to ensure that China stops producing greenhouse gases, or that India stops producing greenhouse gases? I mean, are we going to invade them? Are we going to bomb them? What are we going to do to stop them from doing what they're doing? Now, again, for all of you people who are pulling out your hair and going mental and going, that Benamy, I can't believe he's actually suggesting this stuff. I don't believe in any of it anyway, okay? So calm down, take a pill, massage your temples, okay? I am not advocating bombing communist China.
No, but you're asking some very good questions.
I'm just saying.
Short of that, what do we do?
What are you supposed to do? I could stop driving my car tomorrow. I could stop drinking soda pop tomorrow. I could stop breathing tomorrow.
Let's hope.
And it's not going to. Well, let's hope not, of course. But it's not going to make a difference. Because the problem is in Canada, and the problem is not the United States, and the problem is not the United Kingdom, and the problem is not Europe. The problem is China, India, and other developing countries.
Well, when you look at it, first of all, there was a follow-up article to this, the one you're referring to, and the UN has decided that the 122, now get this, 122 trillion with a T, $1 trillion is what it would take to cap this temperature rise at 1.5, and that's unsustainable.
Isn't that
really?
like the U.S. deficit? No, I'm joking.
Yeah, I know.
It's not that high, of course.
$1 trillion is so much money that it boggles the imagination. It's like trying to think about how far it is from here to the edge of our galaxy. Never mind the universe. Okay, but just when you try to comprehend things in that scale, and this falls into that $122 trillion. I think if I understand the definition right, a trillion is 1,000 billion, right? Because a billion is 1,000 million.
Yes.
Okay, so that's 122 times that amount of money. And we have no... just to understand how much a billion is, if you took it and stuck it in a building, because if you put it in a bank, you'll throw it all off with interest, and you spent $100,000 a day, every day, 365 days a year. And I defy anybody to do that, by the way. It would take you 27 years to spend $1 billion. $1 trillion is 1,000 times more than that, and then it's 122 times more than that.
Right.
It's just you just can't get your... Okay, so the idea that what I'm saying is anybody who knows anything about economics, understands even a rudimentary, remembers their high school biology, would come to this conclusion a long time ago. And the UN just figured it out now?
Well...
Or maybe admitted it now is a better way to put it.
Well, but this raises a separate but important question, and that is let's assume for a moment that it is sustainable, because they're saying now it's not sustainable from an economic point of view. Totally understand that, but let's say it is. The irony in all of this, and there are many ironies,
yes,
is that the only way to generate that kind of money, or anywhere near that kind of money, is through capitalism. And typically, the people who are in favor of greater regulation in order to reduce greenhouse emissions, in order to prevent man-made climate change, are typically on the left of the economic theory spectrum,
right.
And they don't generally believe in capitalism. So the question remains, not only what are we going to do about China, but from a dollars and cents point of view, how are you going to have the money that's necessary to do whatever has to be done after you've bombed China into Kingdom Come, I guess.
And they might have something to say.
If you don't have any, and they might have something to say, and that's a subject completely different, worth exploring, maybe on a future show, is the emergence of China as a serious global military power.
Absolutely.
And the obvious question, why? But let's set that aside for a moment, okay? So you bomb China flat, okay? Well, that would take care of the problem, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would.
I guess you wouldn't have to. Yeah, I guess you wouldn't have to spend that $120-some trillion if you just got rid of China.
$122 trillion to bomb China flat.
I don't know.
Small place.
I can't believe we're talking about this. Well, we're not talking about it seriously because it's not a serious topic.
Well, but the whole point is, you still run into people every day who think the UN is this great, wonderful body where all kinds of good things happen. They have no idea what really goes on at the UN. And to be honest, neither do you and I. We just know most of it's not very good.
Well, to be honest, neither do they.
Yeah, fair enough. That's a good point, too. But I guess I just get tired of hearing this ongoing nonsense coming from a body that has a political agenda that is trying to foist upon the rest of the planet,
right,
and using climate and environment to do it.
But look, I'm not a fan of the United Nations by any stretch of the imagination. But remember, the United Nations is only a name. It's an association of individuals, and a lot of those individuals, are not the United Nations. I mean, this has become such a fad today that it's just it's the only thing I could take comfort in, Nick, is the fact that being a little bit of a history buff myself, I understand that throughout history, crazy ideas have gripped society, and the only thing that's really different today is the speed with which crazy ideas could be disseminated and thus accepted by people who are unwittingly bamboozled, I guess is the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And I'm struggling here to find the right words, but bamboozled, I think, is the right word. People, you start citing statistics and showing graphs and things like that, and people they go, "Oh my goodness!" And I think, I don't know what the psychological thing here is, but I sometimes get the feeling that people, I don't know, it's almost like an innate desire for disaster. Okay, that it's I don't know what it is, but it's people tend to be more apt to believe the worst than the best, the bad than the good. People are more excited about giving bad news than they are about giving good news. I mean, is it just me? Is that
no? And you can see this in microcosm if you go to sporting events. Let's take NASCAR as an example. They're not the only example, but they're as good as any example out there. Half the people in the stands aren't there to watch the race; they're looking for the wreck.
It's funny. It's kind of like the rubberneck phenomenon.
That's another. You drive how many times? I'm not going to go down this road very far, but how many times have I, as a truck driver, sat in a 10-mile long backup on a highway, going in a direction where there's no problem? There's an accident on the other side. And on my side, everybody has slowed down to have a look. They're looking for the gore. They're looking for the shock.
So there's a kind of like a psychological
it's a morbid
attraction,
fascination.
Fascination.
Yeah.
And I wonder sometimes how much of that psychological mindset is engaged in the whole global warming, man-made climate change, imagined crisis. I don't know. It's interesting. I'm trying to think of what psychologist. Do we know a psychologist or psychiatrist or other mental health professionals that we can have on the show to talk about this? It'd be interesting. We'll have to dig into my Rolodex to see what kind of bag of tricks I can pull out.
That would be a very interesting conversation, to put it mildly, because it's the sky is falling syndrome. And maybe that's what we should call it, the sky is falling syndrome. Because everybody gets excited. They like to get excited. It's like, why do people go on roller coasters? Now, 2 weeks ago, I was in Canada's Wonderland. Thank you, I survived. I am not a theme park kind of guy. I mean, I don't have any problem with them. If people can make money running a theme park, if other people want to go and pay to get on a roller coaster, knock your socks off. But I'm not going to be standing behind you in line or in front of you. It's the mentality, though, that they get on these massive roller coasters, and they like to be frightened. But in their subconscious, they know they're perfectly safe. And they like the thrill without having the danger of being thrown to their death at 60 miles an hour.
Although, more and more I'm reading and hearing about people who are being thrown to their death at 60 miles an hour off of roller coasters.
Yeah, well,
I think that's happening more often these days. But
that might be just because there's more roller coasters and the bigger and more more elaborate. Canada Wonderland's putting one up that's 3/4 of a mile long and will reach speeds of 80 miles an hour.
It's crazy.
I crazy, yes or no, I have absolutely no interest
Right.
in anything to do with the theme park.
But still safer than smoking marijuana.
Apparently. And who was it? We were watching a YouTube video earlier today by the former mayor of London, and one of his pet peeves is these passive smoking activists who want smoking banned under every circumstance, everywhere, anyway, in case some passerby might get a whiff of a little bit of tobacco smoke. And he gave an interesting statistic. He said if you barbecue hot dogs on a barbecue, you will inhale more carcinogens in a half an hour barbecues than you would in 2 weeks of inhaling secondhand smoke. I'm paraphrasing, but that's in essence what he said. Right. So it's just
Boris Johnson.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's him. Boris
Johnson.
Really? Well, I don't know. Maybe
they don't make him like he is a personality.
Well, if you took there's three main personalities that I'm aware of that have come out of England in the last 20 years. One is Boris Johnson, who you introduced me to tonight, but there's the reason I mentioned him. The other one is Nigel Farage, and the other one is the first guy we talked about,
Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Jacob Rees-Mogg. I've known about him for about a month now, and he is absolutely devastatingly brilliant. And so, if you look at a scale of, if you imagine a scale of smoothness and polish, Jacob Rees-Mogg is on one end where he's highly polished, very sophisticated, very articulate. Nigel Farage is in the middle where he's polished and articulate, and can be very rough when it comes to dealing with his opponents. And then you got Boris Johnson, who's on the other extreme, okay, where he's eloquent and he's smart, but man, he's a lot of fun to watch, that's for sure. Now, I had a reason for bringing that up. There's something about British personalities when they go on the attack, a verbal attack. There's a certain silky subtleness to their wit and to their engagement in political discourse that I really enjoy. And it goes back to people like Winston Churchill with Lady, what was her name?
Lady Astor.
Lady Astor. And I think one of the greatest personal put-downs in recorded history that I've ever heard is when she looked at him one day and said, "Winston, you are drunk." And he said, "Yes, madam, I am. But in the morning I shall be sober, and you shall still be ugly."
I don't now. I stand to be corrected here. I don't actually think that was Lady Astor. I don't know who that was, but
it's still a brilliant.
With Lady Astor, it was Lady Astor was. Let me think. Winston, if I were your wife,
I would give.
No, if I were. Oh, hang on a second. If I were your wife, I would poison your soup. And Churchill responded to that, "Madam, if I were your husband, I'd drink it."
It was tea, but yes, you're right.
Or tea, yeah. Soup.
But again, it's the quickness. It's how light they are on their feet, and how they have a way of just cutting with razor sharpness. And what do you say to that?
Nick, we're going to take a break. Coming up on the first half hour, we'll be back. We've got some interesting stuff, euthanasia in Canada. And so we'll get into that after the break.
You stay there, right there. We'll be right back after this.
Okay, I'm Joe, he's Nick, and you are back in the combat zone with, obviously, Joe and Nick.
That would be us.
That's us.
Now, one of the things I wanted to get your opinion on, Joseph, was this story out of the National Post from yesterday, written by, what's her name now? Sharon Kirk. Good Lord. Sharon Kirkey. I think that's how you say it. Kirkey. Kirkey. Anyway, why don't people have names like Smith or Jones that are easy to say?
Yeah, Kirky's not hard to say.
No, that doesn't. I didn't say it was hard to say. It's hard for me to say.
Okay.
There's a big difference. Anyway, in the headline for the article is Toronto Sick Kids Hospital preparing policy for the euthanasia for youth over 18 that could one day apply to minors. Now, this caught your attention. And first of all, youth over 18, they're not youths anymore. They're adults. So there's a problem with the headline right off the bat. Because at 18, you are considered a legal adult.
Right. Okay. So this story, when we started looking at this story, it actually, the column actually refers to a draft policy discussion paper that was written by a handful of physicians attached to the Sick Kids Hospital, Pediatric Hospital in Toronto. And the discussion that they had was around the theoretical arguments in favor or against the expansion of physician-assisted suicide to include minors who would be under 18 years old, who are capable of making medical decisions themselves, because in most jurisdictions in Canada anyway, a minor, someone who's under 18, who is judged to have the capacity and the maturity to make these decisions for themselves, are actually legally entitled to do this, to make these decisions without parental consent. But that's not the case when it comes to physician-assisted suicide. And the reason for that is because the legislation that enables it, that was passed in 2016, I believe it was, or late 2015, early 2016 or late 2015, the legislation refers to capable adults, and an adult being 18 years plus.
Right.
So the question that these doctors are asking themselves is simply, what do we do in a case of a minor who is essentially under 18 years of age, who has the mental and emotional capacity to make these decisions for themselves and are already legally entitled to make decisions with respect to their health care for themselves? How do we handle them if they are interested in physician-assisted suicide, okay, or medical assistance in dying?
Doctor-assisted dying.
MAID. MAID is everybody's acronym.
Yeah.
Crazy. So that's the acronym that they use, and they're trying to create, in this discussion paper, they're trying to create a philosophical, theoretical framework that can then be used to justify or to buttress the argument one way or the other. And the framework they come up with is that this is medical assisted suicide, or medical assistance in dying, is simply another kind of a healthcare decision. It's just like any other healthcare decision, including the decision, which has always been legal in Canada, to simply say, I don't want to continue with this life-preserving treatment.
Yeah, pulling the plug.
Well, not so much pulling the plug. I guess you could call it that. But what I'm saying is when people actually make the decision while they have the capacity to make the decision.
Yes.
So
yeah.
I have cancer. You're giving me treatment. I want to stop the treatment even though I know I'm going to die in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever, okay?
Right.
So you withdraw treatment. And youth, we're talking essentially teenagers here. We're not talking, 8 or 9 years old. So we're talking, 15, 16, 17 years old, who are not legally adults, but they have the law assumes that they have the capacity to make these decisions without parental consent, or if they choose, even parental knowledge. So that's what this particular draft policy is. When I first became aware of this, before the article was published actually in the National Post, I got a copy of the draft policy, the paper that these doctors had published, and read through it, and was surprised to learn that sometime early in 2016, the new federal Liberal government, very shortly after or around the time when the legislation was passed, mandated a professional, nonpartisan academic council called the Canadian Council of Academics, and they're just academics in many different fields, and they produce reports and they look at different issues and that on behalf of the federal government, and they make recommendations and discuss it. It's not they don't have any legislative power or anything like that, but it's they're fairly influential. And the request that the federal government made of them was to essentially to look at this question of the legislation and the courts that talk about capable adults, and how all of that fits into the whole question of youth. So here's the bottom line. Okay, I don't want to bore listeners too much with it because there's a lot to discuss around it, but I just think it's important to understand the context of the discussion that we're going to have around this. The bottom line is that the law in Canada as it stands now says that minors, people who are under 18 years old, cannot make these decisions. Okay, they cannot have access. They do not have access to physician-assisted suicide. That's the law the way it is now. Doctors at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto are saying that essentially, these doctors are saying essentially that minors ought to have that choice. And in that context, as with all other medical procedures where they have the choice, where they have the law allows them to choose, the doctors should not have to, at the request of the patient, who might be 15 years old, to consult with the parents. So in other words, bottom line, they are saying that you could and perhaps should have physician-assisted suicide available to teenagers, 14, 15, 16 years old, without parental consent or even parental knowledge. And last point, it looks like the federal government now is leaning in that direction. They certainly are thinking about this to the extent where they have asked this panel, this council, to look at this question and to report back. And my understanding is that report is due back before the end of 2018.
Well, besides just the outrage around doctors deciding amongst themselves, when to tell parents critical information about the health and well-being of their children. Besides that, I have a huge problem with that. If I found out that I was not told information like that about one of my children who was underage, I would just literally I don't know if I can express in words the kind of rage that would just, because these children, and they are children until they're 18. They might be older children, but they're still children. They're not. There's so many things we don't let them do because they're not 18 yet. And yet, at the same time, we're told that your input is not welcome and we don't need it when it comes to something as critical as making a decision, a literal life and death situation. That is so a trampling on the sovereignty of the parents over their own children. Okay, that it defies description. So, set that aside, and if you think about what I just listened very carefully to everything you said, and the other thing that struck me about this is I was listening to it thinking the mental gymnastics that these people have to go through in order to justify this, in order to come to this decision. I mean, it just is mind-blowing. Like, here are some of the most highly educated and skilled people in our society having to jump through mental hoops that would make a Chinese gymnast wince with pain, and there's just something wrong here. And it's so fundamental that there is. I'm not going to accuse every doctor of having this or every mental health professional. But there is certainly a strong taint of the God syndrome within the medical profession, and I think this is one time when it's rearing its head.
Well, I'm going to take issue with you on a couple of points, Nick. I think I'm not sure that it's the God complex. I think that, if you met with these, and I don't know any of these particular doctors, but I know doctors who are very much in favor of physician-assisted suicide, and I don't detect a great deal of smugness or haughtiness or hubris in their demeanor and their attitudes. I in fact, just recently, I was speaking with a good friend, doctor friend of ours, who was, talking about end of life issues and how much of a dilemma it is for doctors who want to preserve or prevent, the suffering of their patients. So I'm far more sympathetic. I know this is going to sound terrible, but in that respect, I'm far more sympathetic to the quandary that physicians find themselves in sometimes when it comes to this kind of stuff. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm by any stretch of the imagination soft on this issue, because I'm not. I sympathize with the doctors. I sympathize greatly with the patients who are suffering, but I still think that this is one of those lines that you can't cross, notwithstanding the fact that people are suffering and having to endure pain, because I think that the Rubicon here is the killing. And this is where I differ with you in the second respect. I don't actually think that the mental exercise, the philosophical, theoretical effort that they've had to put in here actually is that great. If you assume that kids of 15 or 16 or 17 years old have the capacity already, which they do in law anyway, to make health-related decisions without parental consent. And I don't think that it's a far stretch. I mean, that 18 years old is an arbitrary number. I know 21-year-olds who are not mature enough to make decisions for themselves.
True, you're
and
right.
I know 14, 15, and 16-year-olds who are far more mature than many 40, 50, 60-year-olds. Now, just let me finish the thought here, okay? Because I'm not justifying it, okay? Let me stress that very clearly. I'm just saying that once you've made the decision that it's okay to legally, proactively end a person's life, whether with or without their consent, once you've made that decision, then everything else eventually tumbles down, because the sanctity of life, is the number one issue. If the sanctity of life is not an issue anymore, then it's very easy to make the case that, why wouldn't you? I mean, and this is the argument some of us were making at the time in this debate about legalizing euthanasia in Canada, is that, people criticize us when we talk about the slippery slope, but the slippery slope is an absolutely perfectly accurate way of describing what happens. You take the big step, one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. Well, that's what we've done here. We've taken the big step. The big step is that somehow it's now an exercise of compassion for us to kill somebody, even at their request. So what we're essentially saying is that life is not inviolable anymore, okay? And if life is not inviolable, then it's very easy to make the case for expanding the practice.
Okay, well, first of all, let me go back a little bit. I understand and am sympathetic to the situation doctors find themselves in, because they didn't ask for this. The government forced this on them. I don't know many doctors who would say, let's do. There were certain lobby groups who had a lot more to do with bringing this law into fruition. and causing this whole debate in the first place. If we simply if we enacted laws that protected the sanctity of life, none of this would be an issue. We wouldn't be having this conversation because this kind of thing would never come up. We wouldn't have to worry about that.
But we did have that was the whole point. The whole point was that the law did protect the sanctity of life, at least at that level.
But what I'm saying, though, is since that has been struck down with this new legislation, or that idea is no longer relevant because it's not protected by law anymore. Okay, the sanctity of human life. Now you have to, and this is what I meant by having to make these twists and turns and leaps and bounds. And I will admit maybe I'm guilty of putting myself in those shoes and trying to come up with something like that because, I still value human life above all other forms of life. And it's so ingrained in me that I cannot imagine holding another position. And if people want to call that dogma or orthodoxy, I don't care what you call it. I think in my mind, it's the right attitude. But to go back to this idea about, junior, why we pick, or this arbitrary number of 18, yeah, you're right. It is an arbitrary number. But if you look at the average, which you can only make a law, you can only pick a number in this case that suits most people most of the time. And that's why you're going to find 15-year-olds and 16-year-olds who are more mature than 25-year-olds. But as a group, as you get older, you are more mature, and they picked the line 18. And whether we like the line or not, whether it's arbitrary or not, that is the line.
Right.
And as long as they're under that age, then I don't think anybody has the right to stand between a child and their parent, or a parent and a child, and withhold that kind of information.
Right. But here's the problem. Playing a little bit of devil's advocate here. And I truly mean devil's advocate.
Yeah, no kidding.
What is... here's the dilemma for a doctor in this case would be, whether it's for euthanasia or anything else, is if a 17-year-old, if a 17 years old, 17 years, 11 months, 3 weeks, wants to have an abortion, but she doesn't want her parents to know, or she doesn't feel that her parents should have to give her consent, the doctor will perform the abortion. So what these particular doctors are saying, if we would perform an abortion, and they didn't use abortion as an example, I'm just raising it, okay? But if we were to perform an abortion, hypothetically speaking, in those circumstances, or if we were to stop treating a terminal patient at their request and not seek consent from the parents because the patient doesn't want the parents to interfere, or disagrees with their parents who are saying, no, you have to continue treatment. And the law says right now, the way the law is right now in Canada is that, doctors follow the wishes of the patient in this case, so long as the patient is deemed to be mature enough to make that decision, irrespective of whether they've reached 18 years or not. So it's a philosophical, it's hard to make the case that you wouldn't extend that same approach in the case of physician-assisted suicide.
But that's not a carte blanche saying, though. That's because when you look at other areas outside the medical field, when can you get your driver's license?
16.
That's a hard. You can't walk in at 15 years, 364 days, and 23 hours and get your driver's license. When can you drink? Same thing. We draw some very hard lines, and like it now. I don't mean to sound incompassionate, okay? Because the scenario that you laid out requires some compassion for the young lady in that scenario. I get it, but at the same time, if we're going to draw hard lines and say these are the ages, and we're going to stick to it in other areas, how can we then turn a blind eye to that when we're talking about something like this?
Right. Well, but I think what we've done is we've strayed a little bit here, because the issue, again, is that exactly, as far as I'm concerned anyway, exactly what those of us who opposed the adoption of euthanasia, the legalization of euthanasia in Canada,
first place.
Exactly what we predicted was going to happen is now happening. Mm-hmm. You've crossed the Rubicon, as I've said. You have accepted that human life can be proactively, purposefully terminated simply because somebody asks for it, whether it's the patient or it's the doctor. Okay.
Right.
Now, in our case right now, it's not the doctor, it's the patient. But what happens in the case where you have patients who are not able to exercise those decisions for themselves, that they're not capable, that perhaps they're mentally incapacitated? What is the theoretical argument that you use now in order to say, no, it's wrong to euthanize those people? You see where I'm going with this?
Yes,
what I'm saying is you can't,
yes.
once you've accepted the proposition that human life is not sacred, is not inviolable, okay, once you've accepted that premise, then it's virtually impossible to make a strong theoretical moral argument against exercising euthanasia in all of those other cases. And what happens is, you know, when we talk about euthanizing, nobody's thinking about euthanizing disabled children, okay? Nobody's thinking about that. Nobody's suggesting it. But as you continue to knock the dominoes down, okay, eventually you get to that point.
That's right.
So it's this, and then a year or 2 years or 5 years from now it's this, and 5 years from now it's this, and before you know it, you're at the point where, you know, we're at one point in time they were talking in this country about abortions limited to the first trimester. Now we have abortions right up until the moment of the virtually, precisely the moment of birth. And that's defined in law. The definition of when a person becomes a person in law in Canada by a Supreme Court decision is when the baby fully exits the birth canal. So in Canada, so long as a foot of the baby is still in the birth canal, you can kill that baby, and it's perfectly legal. Perfectly legal, because it's partial birth abortion. Partial birth abortion is legal in Canada. Now, from an academic, purely objective, purely scientific point of view, there is zero difference between the baby's physical, mental, cognitive development 1 hour before birth or 1 hour after birth. There's no difference, okay? So how do you justify that scientifically? Well, you don't. So once you've made that decision that it's legal, then you don't have any more bulwarks. You don't have any, and there's nothing else there that you can rely on in terms of a strong theoretical argument, okay, against extending the service further and further and further. And this is what inevitably is going to happen with physician-assisted suicide.
And it's not we're not talking in theory here. We've seen this happen in the 20th century. You know, this is the kind of thing that took place in some of the world's most tyrannical regimes. And they started out, you know, with very clear, what they would define as very clear-cut and easy-to-understand cases. But as you point out, once life becomes cheap and disposable whenever it's inconvenient, which is another way of saying when it's no longer sacred, then the dominoes fall. Before long, anybody can be disposed of.
Well, and these friends over dinner when we were talking about this, and this friend of mine is a doctor, and we were having this exact conversation, and I pointed out to him that and his wife that, you know, I don't mean to be unnecessarily provocative, and I know that what I'm saying is an extreme sounding thing, but the reality is that if we're going to simply make academic arguments, then I can make a very strong academic utilitarian argument in favor of euthanizing severely mentally and physically disabled children, because what are they ever going to produce for society? Now, I'm not advocating for that.
No, I get what from an academic point of view.
I don't have a theoretical argument against that, except the sanctity of human life. But I've already conceded, or our society's already conceded, that human life is not sacred.
Well, look what they did in Iceland.
So this is the thing, and Nick, to finish this whole thought, is people think that the Holocaust started with the establishment of death camps, concentration camps, gas chambers, crematoria, all of that stuff. That's not where the Holocaust started.
That's where it ended.
Okay, that was where it ended up.
That's right.
Where the Holocaust started was in mental institutions, where doctors, there was a euthanization program where doctors were euthanizing severely disabled people, and on the basis that they were a burden to society. And from a purely utilitarian academic point of view, they were right.
They
were wrong in what they were doing, but they were only wrong morally. They weren't wrong academically.
Right.
So if you take the moral argument out, which is ultimately nothing more than a philosophical premise, okay, one of the philosophical premises on which our culture is built on, take that out of the equation, and how do you argue against it? And I want to say one more thing about it. There was a T4 program, was what it was known as, and the architects of that program ended up being very, very prominent in the death camp program later on.
Well, one of the most recent examples of this mentality is what happened in Iceland. They brag about having no Down syndrome children on the island anymore. That's because as soon as they detect Down syndrome in a pregnant woman, they abort the baby. That's why they don't have any Down syndrome. Like, there's been no new cases of Down syndrome in Iceland since they implemented that policy. No kidding. You're killing the kids off.
Okay, Nick, we're going to go for a break. I think we need a break after this.
I think so.
It's pretty heavy. So stick around, guys, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
Okay, welcome back to the Combat Zone, folks. We are now heading into Hour 2. I'm Joseph. No, I'm not Joseph. Joseph's over there behind the other microphone. He's Joseph. I'm Nick.
The last segment in the discussion around all of this stuff was just too trying for you, I think. That must be it.
You know something? I was just sharing with Joseph before we came back on the air that when we get into this particular topic, especially the partial birth abortion part, I find it very hard to talk rationally about it, even though it's a completely irrational topic, because of the imagery that comes into my mind thinking about what goes on in a partial birth abortion. That stuff just, I get so angry, I find it hard to think straight. It's probably the best way to put it, because it's such a heinous crime in my mind. That is one of the most... Okay. You know what? I've said all I need to say about that, because I'm just going to explode if I go down that road much further. Going into Hour 2, what we did want to talk about was move over to a completely different topic, something that I can contribute a little more reasonably to, and that is, let's call it the rise of populism around the world. Brazil just held an election, and the let's call it right of center or populist party in Brazil called PLT just won. So now there's another government that is shifting back towards the right. We see it in Europe with from Italy to the Italians just elected a new and when I say right wing, I'm not talking about hardcore right wing, but more right wing than what they.
Well, I think that's part of the discussion we want to have.
Right. So there was Italy. There's the Czech Republic.
Yeah, I still
Hungary.
want to say Czechoslovakia, too.
I know, and I keep.
It's funny because I was just in the Czech Republic a few weeks ago for two days.
Did we actually do a show from there?
No, we didn't do a show from the Czech Republic. We did a show from
Poland.
We did a show
Germany.
from Austria.
Austria, that was it.
I think we did one. Did we do one from Germany? I think we did do one from Germany.
Yeah, we did one from Poland.
I've already
too,
lost
because you were telling me about the salt mine.
Well, no, I was in Poland, but we didn't do a show from Poland.
Okay, you told me about that when you get back. All right. Anyway, so you've got this ever-growing group of countries that are rejecting. Maybe a better way to say it is not so much that they're right wing, but that they're rejecting globalism. They don't like the idea of losing their national identity, and they don't like the idea of having people outside their jurisdiction dictate to them things like immigration policies.
Right, and I think that there are two characteristics. First of all, I do think that you see a merger, if you will, between populism and conservatism to a degree, what we would call conservatism. Now, the parties that you're talking about, they're characterized by two very important principles. The first is that they are generally free market. So they are small government political parties, and in that sense, I think that we would call them conservative,
right?
And nationalist, but nationalist not to the degree that they're anti-immigrant or anti-anybody for that matter, but nationalist to the degree that they're tired of having policies being dictated from bureaucrats that are not accountable to the people in that particular country. So, and how that plays out largely is in immigration. Now, we think about when people talk about limiting immigration, I'm not naive. I'm not going to say or pretend that there aren't people who are concerned with immigration for cultural reasons. And I understand those concerns. I share some of them. But that's not really, when you take some of these right-of-center political parties in Europe, that's not really what's driving them. It's not so much a national identity thing, as much as it's a reaction or a backlash against policies that are being imposed on national governments by supranational, particularly the European Union,
right?
Which is largely run by bureaucrats. They have a European Parliament, but it's very ineffective and very unengaged. So that's and you saw this with Brexit in England, in the United Kingdom. Yep. I should say not England, but the United Kingdom. So the immigration question is a very big question because it's not really just a question of national identity. There is a question of culture, and I think that it is important for us to pay attention to the issue of cultural consensus. And we were talking about this in a different sort of context in the last segment. Okay, there used to be in Canada a consensus, a moral consensus, and our culture was interwoven with that. And so the question, first of all, that people are asking is, on the immigration file, is are we bringing in people into this country in large numbers who do not share those fundamental philosophical premises, okay? The sanctity of life,
right.
The rule of law, freedom of the person, okay? Free will. There's a whole package, that we can probably do different shows about
right.
that I think and are very fundamental to what I think is the conservative idea in the modern sense. Excuse me. But there's another very real practical issue with regards to immigration, and that is that when you bring in large numbers of people, you have to remember, in Europe especially, there's a very large social service infrastructure, and quite apart from simply the physical services infrastructure. I mean, when you plan a city, you plan a certain amount of growth, okay?
Right.
And your tax base, your construction, your infrastructure development, all of this stuff is built around these plans. And these plans all make certain assumptions with respect to population growth. So, when you talk about immigration, people don't realize how important it is to consider roads, sewers, water mains, electrical distribution. All of those are wrapped up in the whole question of population growth. So, it's very nice to say a country like Canada, well, we figure that our population is going to grow by, let's say, 500,000 people a year, of which 250,000 might be immigrants. And I don't know whether those are accurate numbers or not. I'm just pulling them out of the air to illustrate
the sake
point.
of the discussion. Yeah.
So let's say it's 500,000. So you elect a new government, and let's say the new government says, well, we're going to increase immigration from 250,000 to 500,000. So that's a 50% increase in the growth, the annual growth rate of the population that you've planned for. You see where I'm going with this?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so now, and if all of your immigrants are coming into and moving into in Canada's case, mostly Toronto, but Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, but mostly Toronto.
Right.
Okay. The city just explodes. Now, I've talked about physical infrastructure, but what about social infrastructure, welfare, education, okay, healthcare? All of these things cost money, and as the population increases, the burden on the taxpayer increases as well. And, we've gotten away with a lot of this, and I'm not putting the blame on immigration, but in Canada and in Ontario in particular, and we're not that far different from many jurisdictions in the Western world, we've been getting away with not increasing taxes to meet the financial needs of our increased spending on these infrastructures. And healthcare and education are the two big ones in Ontario, and I suspect that they're the big ones in most jurisdictions, period. So who's going to pay for these things? Okay, who's going to pay for all of this stuff? And it's not. The worst part about it is it's not planned. So when you're in little Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic,
right,
or Austria, these are small countries. Okay, irrespective of their population, but even the Czech Republic, I don't know what the population is, but it's not very big.
Well, it's certainly not the United States, that's for sure.
And it's certainly not Germany. But even in Germany, okay, it's a problem because somebody has to pay for this stuff. When you bring people in and they're not working right away and they're not paying taxes right away, they're a drain on the system. And if you plan to bring a certain number in, and that's what you've based your budget on, and then you double and treble and quadruple the number of people that you're bringing in, that has a devastating impact on certain segments of the budget. So what's happening in some of these countries is, in Europe in particular, Nick, is that people are going, we're bringing people in, and we don't have a say in it. Okay, it doesn't matter how we vote.
But you want us to pay for it.
We have a country, we have a government, we have elections, and then the government can't do anything about this problem, and we can't afford to bring these people in, but we have to follow these rules. So you have this populist sort of backlash against the central government. So those are sort of the two elements in a roundabout way of the sort of the new right in Europe.
Now, to answer your question about the Czech Republic population is 10.5 million as of 2016.
Okay, so see, it's like
a fraction.
The Czech Republic is a fraction of the size of Canada. I mean, you drive right end to end in the space of a few hours.
Oh,
except unless you run into traffic, of course. That's a problem.
Then it slows everything down.
Yeah,
it's like Czech Republic. I'm just looking at here in the map. If you could easily drop it into Quebec.
Oh, for sure.
Have plenty of land left over.
Oh, yeah. It's Canadians who don't travel.
Oh, my God. I'll bet you could probably put 100 Czech Republics in Quebec. I've just had a quick look.
It wouldn't surprise me.
Yep.
The Canadians have no idea of how small these countries are in Europe physically, just as Europeans have no concept whatsoever of how big
large.
a country like Canada is.
Yeah.
As a bit of an aside, Nick, it's one of the things where this plays out is that I'm constantly hearing about, intercity travel, for instance, and how they go look at how they're doing it in Germany and look at how they're doing it in the United Kingdom and look at how they're doing it in France. And I'm going, well, Germany has a population of 80, 85, 90 million people in that range. And again, a fraction of the land size of Canada. So everything is so much more compressed. And the major cities, in fact, all of the cities in Germany or in France or in Poland are far closer together. So, intercity travel on the train works in a country like Germany because no matter where you are in Germany, if you get on the train, you can be anywhere in Germany, including the furthest distance away from your starting point, within a number of hours, literally.
83 million, by the way.
Okay, it's 83 million.
And the other factor people do not take into account, first of all, is geography. Secondly, is climate. Okay, and the third one, because let's face it, it's one thing to stand in a relatively moderately climated place like Europe, okay, where the winters they get cold, but they don't get the Canadian winters of minus 40 for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks long in Germany like they do here.
Even in Scandinavia, with the Gulf Stream, even in Scandinavia, the winters are relatively warm. They don't get as cold.
We have some of the harshest winters in the world.
Sure.
The only place that can argue with us about that would be Russia.
In fact, the second coldest, I don't know if it's still this way, but when I was younger, the second coldest capital city on average in the world was Ottawa.
It's not hard to believe.
You know what the coldest was?
I want to say Moscow.
No.
What is it?
Ulaanbaatar.
I don't even know.
Mongolia.
Mongolia. Now that I can believe, and that has more to do with altitude than it does with latitude.
Yeah, and it's not that they have. It's not that the winters are excessively harsh there. I mean, they're harsh, but they're somewhat harsh here too. Relatively speaking, it's average temperature.
But the third element that people don't understand when they start talking about, well, how come we can't get from say Sioux Falls, from Sioux Lookout to Windsor on a train? It's called, first of all, we might be able to someday, but Europe's had 1,000 years to put these infrastructures together.
Yeah, well, there's no way you can get from Kenora. Now we're playing Canadian geography, right?
That's right, yeah.
See how many people know where Sioux Narrows is. I know. I've been there several times, in fact. You can get from Kenora to Windsor by train. You'd have to come down, but you will never get from Sioux Narrows to Windsor by train. Never happened because
you can't get from Moosonee to Windsor anymore by train.
Moosonee's a special case, or Churchill for that matter, because the rail line washed out. But and that's more than a year ago, and they still haven't done anything about it. But it's unbelievable. Churchill, which is actually it's a major port, and
in the summertime.
Well, no, they
have icebreakers.
It's not so simple, okay. But because I have friends in Churchill,
I know we're going to go see them one of these days.
One of these days, yeah. They have to fly everything in. In the summertime, they have to fly everything in,
and that's true in a lot of communities in the high north.
Yes, that's true.
But the point I'm making is that if you look at France, Germany, Belgium, Holland, the United Kingdom, all of those countries around Poland, they have had the time. Like I said, a millennia. Now, they didn't start out with tunnels and so on. When did London build the channel? Not the channel, but when it built the underground? It would have been 1840s.
In the 1800s, yeah. Most of it.
That's when
the original ones, anyway.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So 1840 to 19. Let's say it's 1845 to 1945 is 100 years. Okay, and it's been another 70, almost 75 since then. So almost 200 years for London to develop its underground railway system.
Right.
Now, for those who say, well, what about Japan? Well, Japan's a tiny little place.
And London, at the turn of the century, the turn of the century was only 18 years ago.
The turn of the 20th century.
Turn of the 20th century. So in the year 1900, the population of London, England, was approximately 9 million at that time.
Yes.
9 million.
Then it was still bigger than Toronto.
And, well, Toronto still is not that size.
That's my point.
And it's a small area. It's England, Southern England is a very small area.
Right.
And Japan, well, you're right. Japan, 800 or 900 million people for a while, though I think their population has been declining lately. But it's a pretty small place. So, of course, it's easy to get around. It's easy to build that infrastructure. But, we're way off topic. I mean, the point that I think I was making was that what has been characterized as an anti-immigrant stance on the part of the new right, if I could use that term, okay,
right,
is not based principally or even or even partly really on a dislike for immigrants. It's ludicrous that people think that that's what it is, and it's portrayed in much of the mainstream media that way. There are sound, solid reasons to want to have some control and regulation over immigration, and whether one likes it or not, that includes refugees. So it's very nice for us to say we're going to bring in X number of refugees. I will tell you, the whole refugee crisis, the migrant crisis in Europe, is fading away because what started out as the floodgates being opened, that has not been the case now for about a year. And even many of the people who were brought in, or who were allowed to come in 2 and 3 years ago, many of them ended up being shipped back. So it's not the destination of the easy destination either. But the flood at that time was they just didn't have the capacity to be able to deal with the flood of newcomers.
Well, we're seeing it in a delayed fashion here in Canada with people coming, irregular immigrants is the popular term these days.
And quite frankly, it's a good point. I just want to say, Nick, the number of people that are coming in, the illegal immigrants or the refugee claimants just crossing over the border,
right?
The crisis. If we were in video, people would see me doing those air quotation marks. Isn't really a crisis, okay? It's a trickle, but even that trickle, okay, our cities where they're going to or being sent to are not able to cope with the influx of these people. There's no housing, there's no infrastructure for them. There isn't enough money in budgets to provide them with the kind of social services that they need. What do you do? It's a practical problem, and the left insists on completely ignoring the practicalities of it. Okay, so what are you going to end up doing? Putting them in rundown, abandoned hangars that have been abandoned for 25 years at Downsview Military Air Force Base. Okay, I mean, with no proper running water, and it's fantasy land.
Well, this is one of the areas that I like to think separates conservatives from those who are the more progressive is Stephen Harper's book is out, by the way, and I'm going to go get myself a copy of it, and I'm trying to remember the title. Anyway, he's come out with his book on the rise of populism, and part of it he had a quote, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember it exactly. I should have written it down. What he said on the left, they look for problems to solve. How did it go? Something about the way that on the one side of the aisle, they have this fantasy about how they want things to be, but conservatives deal with how things are. And that, I thought, was a very telling quote, because it really put everything into perspective. You can have all the pipe dreams you want, but before you engage in trying to pursue them, you have to clean up your own backyard. You have to make sure that what you're doing is working, or at least working in some kind of capacity, and make sure that you don't lull yourself to sleep with this feel-good mentality that says, oh, I did something good today, I can go to bed now, and leave people on the street, leave people without... Because when these people come over, you're quite right. We had it down here on the Quebec border where the Army had to put up insulated tents to take people in as they tried to cross the border. The first thing, if I was in charge, the first thing I would have done was start shutting these things down, closing the loophole in the law that allows them to make that entrance in the first place, because it's a slap in the face to all the people who are real immigrants who are standing in line and playing by the rules. That's, to me, one of the biggest rubs, and I think that plays a lot into the rest of it as well.
Here in Ottawa, Canada's national capital, okay, when we brought in Syrian refugees a couple of years ago, okay, we needed housing for them. Mm-hmm. The city of Ottawa took over, in order to house these refugees, shut down homeless shelters, beds for homeless people, in order to provide rooms for refugees. Now, that's not an anti-refugee or anti-immigrant statement. That's just the reality.
Yeah.
It's an illustration of how we don't have the infrastructure, the capacity to be able to deal with some of these things. And I think you're dead right. And I think that Stephen Harper is dead right in that observation. It's what I always tried to teach our children, and that is, you can have the greatest dreams and aspirations, but in the final analysis, you have to deal with the world the way it really is, not with the way
you want it to be.
Would wish it was.
Right.
Okay? Maybe you can work to build the world the way you wish it should be, but you still have to deal with it the way it really is.
And that's a great place. I think we're almost out of time for this segment. We'll be coming back with more. Of course, speaking of dealing with the world the way you want it to be, I want to get into a little bit about... I had lunch with a friend of mine who is a very wealthy man, made his fortune solving problems and being creative and inventive, and how I think it's time that he just... It'll be an interesting conversation. Creativity and innovation is what I want to talk about. All right, with that, we'll take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
Okay, we're in the home stretch in the combat zone. I'm Joseph and he's Nick. No matter what Nick says, don't believe him.
Hey, I only got it wrong once.
Once tonight. And you haven't even had any apple cider tonight.
Yeah, I've been drinking lemon water tonight.
Lemon water. I'm going to test that out. I'm not sure if you've actually been having the lemon water. I don't know what. Trying to think of what. Lemon water. There you go. Let's do that again.
See, this is why we don't let you play with stuff like that.
I am the engineer here.
Yeah. I see that. Okay, one of the things I wanted to get into in this particular segment is the idea that we have. I had lunch with a good friend of mine a couple of months ago, and the man is a very wealthy man, very successful in business, and has made his fortune in the free market. He made his fortune solving problems and being innovative and creative. Now, when I use that phrase, I'm not talking about in the arts. Okay, I'm talking about in the free market from a business sense, from a when I'm talking about, I'm not putting down the arts under any circumstances.
No, of course not.
I just think it's a different kind of creativity. Okay, like somebody who's a good businessman and takes an idea from concept to the market.
Well, you can never go wrong figuring out what people need and then giving it to them.
That's exactly. So the point that I wanted to make, though, is that he was the kind of guy that would take on a challenge and then find a way to make it work, and was rewarded very well for that. Now, he told me over lunch that he had come to the conclusion that there was nothing left to invent, and that now we have to stop worrying so much about creativity and start worrying about redistribution. And I'm looking at him, talk about gobsmacked. The last person on earth I ever thought I'd hear that out of was this gentleman, and I couldn't disagree with him more. All right, because if you look at where we are now, first of all, they've said this before. This is not new. They said this in 1900, and I can't remember who said it, but somebody of some kind of historical renown said that there's nothing left to invent. That was in 1900. I think there's been plenty of inventions and innovations since then. So I completely disagree with my friend as much as I respect him. All you have to do is just look upwards. Like, even if you say that, okay, right now, we are at the end. It's like, if you think about airplanes, at the end of World War II, the piston-driven airplane had reached the epitome of its development. You couldn't really, to get any more out of it, cost larger and larger sums of money. Sailboats is another example. You had to go completely radically in a different direction. So they came up with jets. And that's where the jet age took off, was because of the demands that could no longer be met by the technology of the day. They had to come up with a new way of doing the same job. So that was a huge leap forward. But we're at that kind of a cusp right now. If you look at the technologies that are available, you have everything from 3D printing. They're working on running nuclear reactors with a substance called helium-3. Now, they haven't perfected it yet, but they're working on it. And what that will do is replace radioactive nuclear fuel with this substance that's found on the moon, and it's also in much greater quantity on one of the other planets, Venus or Jupiter. I forget which one it is, but a tremendously powerful substance. So what I'm saying is that we're on the verge of technological breakthroughs that are going to so radically change. Think about it: artificial intelligence, robotic learning, all these things. Everybody's bemoaning the loss of jobs and technology, to technology. But that's not new either. We've been through this before as well. If back in 1870 you were an oaken bucket maker and somebody said steel's lighter, holds the same amount of water, and costs a lot less to produce, all of a sudden you're out of a job. But the world benefited because now you could carry water in a steel bucket, not in the old oaken bucket. So we're at the same kind of transitional stage now. So if you look to the heavens, if you say, well, Earth is finite, yes, but the galaxy and the universe aren't. And if you look at things like take the asteroid belt, how many uncounted billions of tons of raw materials are there? Helium-3 again on the moon. If you were to go, I was looking at a NASA site the other day, and there's different private enterprises and different governments who are exploring the idea of mining the moon. They're now figuring out they can't create gravity yet, but they're beginning to understand it. And they found the, what was it? They say it's the Big Bang. Now, maybe it is. Who knows? I never really spent a whole lot of time worrying about evolution versus creation. But at some point, it had to start somewhere. And they think they found where that is. And they detected the burst of gravity that those stars 400 billion years ago, when they exploded, they were able to detect that explosion and the gravity that it put out. So the reason I mention it is because understanding is the first key. Before you can learn how to do something, you first have to understand the concept. So they're beginning to get that around. Now, imagine we could be generations away from artificial gravity, other than making things spin in space. But think about the advances in medicine. If you had a floating factory orbiting the Earth in low grav or virtually no gravity scenarios, what kind of products could we make? What benefits? In other words, what I'm trying to say is that right now I think we're on the cusp of a golden age of innovation and creativity unlike anything the world has ever seen. Because now we're not just limited to Earth. We have at least our galaxy to play with, and then beyond that, who knows? So,
our solar system. Maybe.
Our solar system, yeah, that's probably a better way to put it. But when I hear people, and this is what I if I was 19 or 20 years old right now, like I'm too old for this, I'll never see a lot of the technological advances that I'm talking about, like quantum computing and so on. I might see some of that, but for the rest of it, I don't know. If it happens, great. But already I'm not in the category of people that are going to push this envelope forward. My sons maybe, or maybe their children. It's not that far away. And my sons, my children, they're all approaching, adulthood now. So it's only 20 to 40 years before we're talking grandchildren old enough to be able to participate. So who knows what the future holds? But to be pessimistic or to say that there's no reason to be creative, I think that goes against conservative principles, because when you look at technology and all the times that man has come up against a wall, okay, and said, how do we do this? Whether it takes something as simple as inventing the wheel, all right? We did it not because we thought circles were cool, but because there was a better way of transporting things. Mankind has built within his psyche this, how do I do this better? Because inherently, men are lazy. And the less work they have to do to get the job done, the better off it is. And they're also, they have this creative streak within them, the idea of what's around the next corner, this sense of adventure, if you want. And when you combine these ingredients into a mind like, let's say, Einstein, oh, man, where are we going to be 100 years from now?
Well, I always say that, the saying that necessity is the mother of all invention. Mm-hmm. I actually think that you were closer to the reality when you were talking about laziness. I think laziness is the mother of all invention, to be honest with you, is that people want to do things easier, not necessarily better, but easier. And most of the time, better is easier, but not all of the time. Not all of the time. Look, you're describing a futuristic world that we may or may not be on the cusp of, but I don't know that itself is conservative. I think that the conservative point of view or worry would be that somehow or other, in our rush to the future, we're forgetting that we also have a contract, if you will, with the past, that there is a wisdom that we've acquired over a period of time, and that, yes, innovation, advancement, moving forward, progress is a good thing, or can be a good thing. It could be a bad thing too. Well, and that's the real question. The question is how do we?
Not can we do it, but should we?
But not even that. Not even that. It's I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this here, Nick, is how do we utilize the tools and the technology and the knowledge that we're acquiring if in our rush to adopt it and to embrace it, we're jettisoning all of that acquired wisdom and dare I say it, the philosophical premises upon which our society and our culture is based.
Yeah.
Because so much of what we believe in, and we were talking about this offline before, so many things that we believe in, just simply the notion that freedom is better than not being free. There's no scientific evidence of that. Okay, that's an ideological perspective that we bring to the table, and it's good. Okay, but I find that more and more we're abandoning these premises, and we're just sort of basically saying, well, forget it. I can't prove it empirically, therefore, and I'm a religious guy, so let me just make the religious case and say I believe that there's a God, but I can't prove it. Therefore, the progressive sort of mindset is, well, if you can't prove it, then we have to just assume that it's not true, which itself is a philosophical premise. Okay, and that's the thing is that there are so many things. Oh, okay, here something just popped into my memory. Okay, a number of years ago, I had the pleasure or displeasure of participating in a CBC television debate with who was it that wrote the oh goodness gracious, now you see I've lost the names of these guys. He wrote the God fallacy or whatever there is.
You're not talking about you're not talking about people like Christopher Hitchens and people like that.
No. Dawkins, was it Dawkins?
Oh, Richard Dawkins.
Richard Dawkins, that was the name, right? So there was a whole group, and there was myself and a couple of other people, and we were in the studio in Toronto, and Richard was, I guess he was in England, and I keep saying England, I mean the United Kingdom, although I guess he was in England if he was in London. Anyway, and so he had done a documentary, and they aired the documentary, and then we had this discussion around it, a debate, and Richard at the time kept on talking about and he did this often through the documentary, and I assume through the book. I frankly never read any of his books. But he kept on talking about things like, science has something to say about this, and science has something to say about that. So why shouldn't science have something to say about whether or not there's a God? And finally, after this, and I came back with the answer that, well, there are many, many things that science doesn't have a say in. Science doesn't have a say in literature, okay? People say this is a good book. Tell me the scientific theory that proves that Shakespeare was a great playwright. There are things that don't fall into the scientific realm. And the question of God, while I can make logical arguments, logical philosophical arguments, I can't prove or disprove the existence of God scientifically, and that's a very narrow definition. Okay,
right.
So I guess the point I'm making is that in our modern progressive pseudo scientific mindset in society today is that we've abandoned the notion that there are very real things out there that are not scientifically that don't fall into the realm of empirical observation. And I'm not talking about ghosts and goblins and and angels and demons or anything like that. I'm talking about things that we deal with day in and day out. What makes music pleasurable? Okay, and I'm not talking about a particular brand of music. I'm just asking the question: why do people enjoy music? Why do people create music? Why do people create literature? We deal with so many things day in and day out in our lives that have zero scientific basis, okay, that we make judgments on. I like this, I don't like this. Why is ice cream enjoyable? Some people like it, some people don't. Tell me the science behind that. And that's my concern. My concern is that we're not only are we losing our respect and our reverence for the past, and that doesn't mean holding on to it and never changing, but it means innovating. You know, you use the term innovating. Innovations are wonderful things. Let's not abandon those things that we believe in.
Well,
let me just, sorry to interrupt, Nick. Sorry. One last point, because I'm going somewhere with this, okay?
Okay.
And here's where I'm going. I'm not so sure that I'm going to enjoy the future. I'm really not. I like old things. I like books. I have a Kindle, but as we talked about before, I like books. I like sitting around. I like smoking my pipe. I like smoking the odd cigar. I don't like cigarettes, but I do the odd cigar from time to time. Okay, I don't think people are going to have as much fun in the future. I really don't.
I'm more optimistic, and I'll tell you why. First of all, if you look at the idea of exploring the heavens, as I was talking about before, that not only is not forgetting our past, that's a nod to it. Because man has been an explorer since we got tossed out of the garden.
Yeah, it could be. Could be.
That's how I see it.
Yeah, it could be,
okay?
But it may not be.
Well, okay, you want to talk about philosophical arguments. I tend to, in this particular case, I'm a lot more optimistic about it because think about it. When you watch a young child, make a discovery for the very first time, maybe riding the training wheels come off the bike and for the first time they pedal down the driveway on their own, the look on their face,
of abject terror?
That's more of the parents of abject terror. Now I've turned this loose on the world. Oh my God, what's going to happen to me now? But the child is completely awestruck that they can now do something they never thought was possible. And in a little more, I'm being very simplistic in my explanation, but if you look at every time mankind sets out to do a great thing, whether it's discover the new world or to build, I don't want to say the greatest ship that ever floated because it sank. That's not greatest ship that ever floated, but the unsinkable ship. Okay, and that's a whole conversation. But the point I mean is every time they come up against this massive obstacle that's in their way for progress, they find a way we find a way around it. Now, I like to look at it because I'm a religious man like you are, that's not that the desire to conquer that is God-given. The desire to find a way around it is God-given. And the desire to explore and make new discoveries and go places, to go over the hill, comes from the same source. So for me, we're not losing the old stuff because I like the same things you do. I like to smoke my pipe. I like the feel of a book in my hand versus reading it online. Those kinds of things. I like. My life has a certain rustic quality to it. I like being outdoors and hunting and fishing and not in this get back to the earth, hug the planet kind of way, but just in a more traditional sense. So I don't think that you have to surrender one to gain the other. And I think that when people understand, and I think eventually they will, nothing lasts forever. Like this, we're in a kind of a dark age right now from a moral point of view. But I don't think that's going to last either. I'm a little more optimistic about the future than that. So that's why when I look up at night and I see that moon and I think about the potential for what we can do if we want to, we've already been there. It's not like we don't know how to get there. Just start with that and see where it leads. Because, boy, I'm telling you, we've got some very bright young people coming up. We only hear about the bad ones. We never hear about the good ones. The really brilliant ones, that are in school learning all the things they're going to need to learn in order to push this next step forward. We never hear about them, but I have no doubt there's tens of thousands, if not millions of them. So I'm a lot more optimistic than you are about the future. I think I'm going to really enjoy it.
Well, I'm not pessimistic. I just know me, and I know that I'm not even sure that I belonged in the 20th century, Nick.
I will admit, there's times I wish I was living in the 18th century.
It's just
there are certain aspects of that.
Now, but when I say that, okay, then I think, okay, but I do like my creature comforts, and let's face facts. There weren't a whole lot of creature comforts in the 1800s.
There weren't, but you did enjoy them more.
Yeah, well, this is it. And without, big government, the nanny state and peering over your shoulder, monitoring what you were doing and what you're not doing.
Well, it's funny you mentioned, let me expand on that a little bit. Think about this. Life in 1875 in Canada. We didn't even have income tax.
Oh, well, listen, get me started on that.
Okay, but the point I'm making is you succeeded or failed based on your own strengths or weaknesses.
Yeah, but when you earned $1, you got to keep the dollar.
That's my point.
Right.
You survived or you failed. You collected dollars to buy the things you needed to survive based on your strengths and weaknesses.
Right. In Canada, the income tax was inaugurated as a way of paying
off the war debt from World War I.
During World War I, yeah.
Right. It was 3%. It was a 3% levy on the top 3% earners in the country. We have come a long way since then. But think about this. You had the most, I think that's probably the pinnacle of individual freedom. There were no regulations about everything from firearms, and there were no, muskets. It's hard to have a mass shooting with a musket. But the point is, people didn't go around blowing each other away. They didn't, they had their social ills, no doubt. But it wasn't like there was a tremendous community cohesion, if I can use that. But looking to the future, I think that once you set foot on another planet or another moon, you got a clean slate.
Right. Okay. But I'm just going to say this, Nick. I'm not pessimistic. I'm not optimistic. And
are you trying to say pragmatic?
Pragmatic. I mean, but I'm realistic. Okay. Dealing with the world the way it really is, and the way it really is right now is that, notwithstanding all of the nice ideas about progress that you've just articulated, and I grant you that these are all nice and pleasant and exciting, but I really am concerned that we have to get some of the fundamentals right. And what does the future look like with all of that technology and all of that progress if we don't value human life? What does humanity look like? These are the questions that worry me, and I worry what kind of a world, or more precisely, what kind of a society that we are going to leave for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren.
Well, let me answer you with this. If I didn't think that there was any chance of reversing this trend, then I wouldn't bother with the fight. I don't believe in fighting fights I know I'm going to lose. So one of the reasons, and it's one of the reasons I continue to do this show, it's one of the reasons why I try to raise my kids in with that sense of sacredness for human life, in their own lives. I believe eventually that will come back. Nothing stays the same forever. Everything swings on a pendulum. And this lack of respect for life cannot last. It has to come back. It's the law of nature.
Could be.
Well, one way to find out.
Yeah, well, look, Nick, we're coming up on 2 hours. I think it was a great show.
I enjoyed it.
And next week, ladies and gentlemen, tonight, it's the 10th of October, 2019. The clock has started. The countdown has begun to legal marijuana in Canada. So when we are with you next week, it'll be legal marijuana in Canada night. So it'll be cannabis in Canada night. So, you know, you want to tune in to that show because we are going to have a good time.
Did you say it'll be Canada's?
Till next week.
All right. Have a good night, folks.